The greatest trick the devil ever played may have been convincing the world that he didn't exist, but the most profound trick ever played on mankind was probably when the left convinced the average American that the left-right dichotomy can be summarized as follows. Anyone left of center advocates for economic and social equality, human rights, sunshine, rainbows, and puppies, and that the right is when racism. The right is when bigotry. The right is when oppression of others. Or as they say when they over-intellectualize it in order to hide their clear and blatant bias, the right is socially hierarchical. This lie is so ubiquitous that, at least at the time of this recording, that is literally the first paragraph from the Wikipedia page on right-wing politics. It reads, and I quote, "Right-wing politics is the range of political ideologies that view certain social orders and hierarchies as inevitable, natural, normal, or desirable." In addition to this, I have heard countless people tell me that this is exactly what they were taught in either high school or in college by some far-left political science professor. But it's just not true, it's a lie. And more than that, even if you find the overwhelming dissemination of this lie more convincing than the common sense facts that I am about to lay out before you, understand this. Even if what you're saying is true, it isn't productive. For example, right now, if you are on the left, or even if you aren't, but you still feel this inclination to go, far left political science professor, he says, I'm sure this is going to be very unbiased. Then there you already have established the importance of being objective. So would it be objective of me to say that communists, for example, believe in establishing a government that they know will fail? No, because even if I am right and that government will fail, it is clearly not their belief that it will. In the same way, this is not a lie that you can just brush off. I clearly don't believe that I believe in social hierarchies. And if you go out and ask a libertarian, a Tea Party conservative, or any other anti-authoritarian right-winger if he or she believes in social hierarchies, the answer will almost certainly be no, or at best a few reluctant yeses. Because, don't get me wrong, there are some ideologies that are considered right-wing that would give a fervent yes. For example, there are still some aristocratic beliefs among the right. The issue, however, is that this generalization does not hold true for all on the right. And I would argue that aristocracy is the exception to the rule, not the rule itself. So even if the conclusion is true that beliefs on the right lead to social hierarchy, despite whether the right sees those beliefs as hierarchical or not, by virtue of that belief just existing, the belief that people like me hold that it is not hierarchical, the core debate then between the right and the left is predicated on what constitutes a social hierarchy, and by necessity of that, the difference between the left and the right boils down to what each side sees as a problem, and what each side sees as a solution to that problem. The statement that right-wingers can be lumped together under the belief that social hierarchy is at least inevitable is a partial truth in so much as the right does tend to believe in things that the left may deem as social hierarchies. But that's just it. It's not as though the right sees social hierarchies as inevitable solutions to problems. We just don't see the problems that you believe exist. If, for example, you say capitalism creates a situation in which two people trade, and this interaction favors one person in the deal over the other, the right wouldn't view the deal itself as creating a social or economic hierarchy, because that insinuates that this is a problem that can be avoided through the implementation of another belief system in order to actually attribute the imbalance to capitalism and trade rather than reality itself. If you believe the imbalance can be avoided, you have to ask yourself, well, how would you do so? Even if we could find an impartial arbiter, and even if this arbiter did not require payment for his work, isn't this placing the authority of the arbiter over those in the deal? That is, a hierarchy. Hopefully you can begin to realize how absurd this is. Even within a framework of state socialism, for example, you would still have a group of people who have authority over others, even if by some measure those involved in the deal have their own vote. I mean, think about it. If those in the trade are at odds with each other, each wanting a resolution that favors them, then they will stalemate each other. So if each person is perfectly represented in government, then their votes will stalemate each other in government. The only way to move forward is for government to have authority over them. Because if it did not, then either one of them could, having equal power with his government, stalemate it. And just the same, even if it were possible and we tried to make it so society as a whole governed itself, in all technicality, this would still be us placing the authority of the collective, or at least the will of the collective, or the good of the collective, over that of the individual. Hierarchies are inevitable, but not because I think that, and that itself is a matter of my belief. I don't imagine that many social liberals would consider their beliefs to incorporate the notion that hierarchies are inevitable. Socialists and communists especially would not believe that. So obviously, hierarchies, at least in the sense of there being an imbalance in social order, are not something that the right generally believes in, because nobody believes in that. But again, here, no matter if you agree with the conclusion I've reached or not, you've seen that I can make the argument that your beliefs are hierarchical in accordance to what I believe, and that I do not believe that my ideology supports social hierarchy, to which you could say the exact same thing. This clearly then does not differentiate us. Neither one of us would accept that we believe in social hierarchies. We simply disagree on what a social imbalance is. That is why, if you are on the left, you will see my views as creating an imbalance, and I will view your beliefs just the same. Capitalists do not see hierarchy in their beliefs. They see meritocracy. And just as the left does not see something like intersectionality or identity politics as creating an inverse hierarchical structure of victimhood, they see it as simply acknowledging the struggles and disadvantages that certain groups may have. The right does not view concepts like moral goods, social roles, or family structure as things that have authority over us in any hierarchical sense. They are just things that are. They are things that exist objectively, matters of reality, and not problems that we recognize or solutions that we propose. So ultimately, rejecting the notion that the right is socially or economically hierarchical is not bias on my part, because bias is viewing the premise of the opposition through your own belief system rather than trying to find some objective standard. Yes, the left thinks right-wing ideas lead to social imbalance, and yes, there is some partial truth to the idea that, as I've clearly been arguing, we think hierarchies are inevitable and natural. But to say that as though the right just surrenders to that fact is not true. Capitalists favor free market ideals because, among many other reasons, it avoids placing corruptible individuals in powers of economic authority over others. And likewise, social movements in the right aim to create smaller government, have less government involvement, and put an emphasis on the individual rather than the collective. It is so dishonest to say that the right believes social hierarchies are inevitable when all of those beliefs we just covered are all about not giving power of one man to another or to some sort of institution. The right is about individualism. And ironically, if you wanted to thoroughly understand the difference between the left, at least the moderate left, and the right, you would have to trace this difference back to where it began, which is also where this lie began, the French Revolution. You see, back then when they were drafting their constitutions, divisions grew in the French National Assembly over what the new government would look like. You had conservative aristocrats who were loyal to the king and wanted to preserve the monarchy, but then you had radicals and liberals who opposed the monarchy. In what I can only imagine resembled the cliques of a school lunchroom, a benign and trivial fact went on to shape political terminology for the next 200 years. The aristocrats sat on the right, and the liberals sat on the left. This is the origin of the left and the right, but unfortunately not many people want to see it as just that. The origin. If you go around providing people with the arguments I have given you today about why these classifications of the right do not work, without a doubt you will be met with them condescendingly explaining to you the history of left and right, specifically just the French Revolution. So here is what you need to do. Equally as condescending, you need to tell them, okay, sit down, because this is going to be tough, and I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, but the French Revolution is over. It has been for 235 years. You know, it's done, and it does not aptly summarize modern politics. The liberals of the French Revolution in terms of American politics are more appropriately described by their retronym, classical liberals. You see, without making this a video about the philosophical movements behind the French Revolution, suffice it to say that people like Descartes, Spinoza, Voltaire, Rousseau, and Locke were greatly influential. For example, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen was a document that can be thought of as being sort of the French version of the Bill of Rights during the French Revolution. It was drafted by Lafayette, and yes, that Lafayette that you saw in Hamilton, if you watched Hamilton, he was a moderate leftist who drew inspiration from Rousseau, Locke, and other Enlightenment-era philosophers of natural law. He wrote a Declaration of Rights that greatly resembles our own Declaration of Independence and Bill of Rights, which makes sense given that Jefferson in some capacity helped Lafayette write it. And I just want to read you the second article of this declaration. The aim of all political association is the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man. These rights are liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. If you can already see where I'm going with this, yes, that last part may sound a bit more left-leaning than, say, the principles upon which America was founded. But I think you need to consider that by oppression, those under French feudalism were probably thinking less about microaggressions and more about the tyranny that our forefathers also wrote about. And also, just to give you an example of what it meant to be a part of the radical left during the French Revolution, Jean-Paul Marat, political theorist and journalist who constantly wrote in opposition of the more conservative and even the moderate members of the National Assembly, believed in wildly radical ideas, such as the abolition of the monarchy, graduated income tax, shorter terms for the then mandatory military service, state-sponsored vocational training for workers, and basic welfare programs. Sorry. Now, it should be said that some have attributed more radical left-wing views to merit, such as the nationalization of specific industries like the mining industry, and the belief in the redistribution of wealth, especially in terms of class struggles. However, the extent to which these claims are made are highly revisionist. Those on the far left, like Merritt, did believe in some sort of class struggle, but this was under literal and actual feudalism, where people were divided into classes and denied basic fundamental human rights. There's a difference between opposing feudalism, in which you take back the fruits of your labor because someone essentially made you a slave, and then the complete redistribution of wealth under the abolition of private property. Merritt did not support the abolition of private property. He was not a paleo-Marxist, or whatever you would call him. And really, the only reason that history seems to remember him as a member of the far left is because of the extent to which he encouraged violence in support of his, what would now be considered otherwise somewhat moderate beliefs. So while this is grossly oversimplified, and I do not claim to be an expert on the French Revolution, the difference between the moderate left, the left, and the far left goes as follows. I want rights, but maybe a little bit of a monarchy is cool, just as long as you guys can, vibe with the whole rights thing. No. I want rights and a democratic republic, no monarchy. You. I like what you guys are saying, but this isn't gonna work. You're all just a bunch of trying to make peace with them. We should just kill these people. Like, who needs a constitution when we can just kill everyone and anyone that gets in our way? Again, historical accuracy? But you get the point. The left-right dichotomy of the French Revolution doesn't live up to modern-day politics, especially here in America, where we are not talking about reinstating a monarch that we never had. The left will try to manipulate you into believing otherwise, with murmurs of fascism and dictatorship. But beyond these partisan lies, the truth becomes clear. If conservatives and other right-wing ideologies seek to uphold traditional values, as many would claim that they do, the traditional values of the Western world that we would then uphold are founded upon one ideology: classical liberalism. As far as secrets go, this is not a well-kept one. It's just news to anyone who chooses to allow rhetoric to shape their worldview, rather than doing a basic Google search. Who do American right-wingers romanticize? The Founding Fathers. So, one Google search, who inspired the Founding Fathers? The result will show, among others, John Locke. And who is the father of classical liberalism? You're not going to believe this. It's John Locke. You see, if you've been paying attention, you can probably see the puzzles already coming together with Lafayette and Jefferson, the comparisons between the French Constitution and the American one, and the similar influences both movements had from Enlightenment-era philosophers. These nations went through similar political movements, the only difference being that while there were some loyalists in America, by and large, we never really had the same issue of aristocracy. The left won. The left won in America, and in the rest of the world, absolute monarchies are almost non-existent, and constitutional monarchies are far and few between. Some nations like Great Britain have these symbolic monarchs, but they're basically like mascots with no actual power more than anything else. Classical liberalism won the Enlightenment-era culture war, so much so that it became the basis for pretty much all governments that currently exist. And we don't even think of it as a political ideology more, as much as we see it as the basic premise of society, where now each side of the modern aisle seeks to appropriate the past. Liberalism became tainted for conservatives, libertarians, and other right-wingers when social liberals co-opted the term, causing many, through heated partisan politics, to forget our shared history. We are all the third estate. We are the working class men who sat on the left and wanted a government that protected their freedoms and gave them a voice. The right of the old died out, making the distinction of the right being socially hierarchical obsolete. In reality, the distinction now relates more to the difference between moderates and leftists of the past, because one question remains unanswered among the third estate of the world. What is the role of government? And I think that unanswered question is the difference between the modern right and the modern left. Again, at least the moderate left. And to further elaborate that, I want to go back to why I singled out John Locke out of all of the other Enlightenment-era philosophers, because I think he has a quote that is really at the core of this issue. Everyone as he is bound to preserve himself and not quit his station willfully, so by the like reason when his own preservation comes not in competition, ought he as much as he can to preserve the rest of mankind. If you're a frequenter of my channel, I'm sorry that I believe this is like the third time that you've heard this quote, but I think it's just kind of that important. Because, for example, in that one single quote, it summarizes what the left and the right agree on, but also what they are still arguing to this day. What does it mean to have an obligation to help your fellow man? Does that mean that we are compelled to do so in a more collectivist sense of social welfare and strong social security? Or does it simply mean that we as individuals should not harm each other, but instead strive of our own volition and without government involvement to help others? This is the left-right dichotomy. Social and economic collectivism versus individualism. And deeper than that, as a prerequisite to this division, the battle between left and right is an argument over the very nature of man himself. In order to say that society can fulfill its obligation to aid the downtrodden, we must first believe that society is capable of doing this, and that the subject of our aid is deserving of it. In this, right-wing ideologies are often, if not always, the rejection of these humanistic and altruistic beliefs. Sure, conservatives may believe in very traditionalist notions of charity, the idea of giving to orphans and widows, and sometimes the needy in general, but often the state's role in such an act is opposed on the grounds that the state cannot be trusted to justly appropriate these funds. Likewise, the character of the recipient may be called into question, either on the grounds of the person not being deserving, or more often under the premise that giving to these individuals is short-sighted, in that it creates a state of dependence. In whatever circumstance, the difference between left and right seems to be a far more ancient argument masquerading as something new. Because the difference between left and right is actually just the argument of glass half full versus glass half empty in regards to human nature. On one side you have optimists, or as the other side would call them, the naive. And on the other side you have the realists, or as the optimists would call them, the pessimists. At the core of every political debate, you have the question of whether all men are born intrinsically selfish and sinful, as someone like Hobbes would point out, in which life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Or if we are born pure, as Rousseau claimed, and negative traits are learned through our environment and by extension of that, ingrained in us by culture and institutions. If man is self-serving in the fullest extent possible, then, as Sisyphus tried to roll a boulder up a hill, so too would we be trying in vain to correct the inevitable and unavoidable truth of human nature. Our only hope then would be to rely on systems of naturalism and mutualism in both economic and social affairs. We would create a system like capitalism where greed pits man against man, driving prices down through naturalistic mechanisms like competition and supply and demand. We create governments where we do not rely on the good nature of others to artificially enact change. Positions of power will always attract those who abuse it, and mob rule will always de-incentivize individual responsibility. If, on the other hand, man is inherently good, then it is his environment that corrupts him. Greed is simply a learned defense, and man can be made to share in the abundance of resources that the world offers. Governments are only ineffective because of the people operating them, and we can learn to live together in complete harmony. Right? Well, no, obviously not. I think that the left often refuses to conceptualize the landscape of politics in this way because it forces them to realize that we play a tricky game in which the solution to the problem and the problem itself are one and the same. People. Collectivist ideology requires us to believe that people are inherently capable of its application, or in other words, that they can be trusted to enact these policies. But at the same time, leftists know that this is impossible because we either have to believe that humanity as a whole lacks whatever solution is necessary to achieve this higher order of social being, or believe that they already have the solution but are incapable of enacting it. And so if they lack the solution, are we seriously supposed to believe that the answer to all of the world's problems is Marxism, or anything like that, which we have yet to envision, in which it's as simple as just share? And despite the fact that the shadowy ruling class has allowed us to hear this message, somehow they have prevented us from taking it to heart. Yet that doesn't speak volumes about the working class itself, that we don't want to share, that we are inherently selfish. And so if we are not capable of enacting this humanitarian solution, will we ever be? And why, or why not? Because ultimately, whatever boogeyman you blame for your problems, be it the 1%, the bourgeoisie, the patriarchy, heteronormativity, institutionalized white supremacy, if bad behavior is learned from oppressive institutions, where did the patriarchs of these institutions learn their ways? This mindset doesn't work. These harmful ideas come from people, and so people are the sources of all of these problems. That isn't to say that I'm conceding to the complete lack of trust in the collectivization of society, because that would mean the complete abolition of society as we know it. And the naturalists and traditionalists could not deny the time-tested nature of society any more than they could argue against the social norms that they uphold within those societies. We know that society works. We know that we have to trust people a little bit, but In that, we know that far-left ideologies do not work. They require us to trust people a lot, but at the same time and in the same way, not trust them at all. The Democrats pander to far-left ideologies like critical race theory and feminist theory, telling us that institutions are racist and sexist, but at the same time we should trust these institutions. And if we don't, we are far-right conspiracy theorists. The far-left engages in this doublethink of ideas derived from Marxism, ideas entrenched in conflict theory, in which problems are socially constructed, yet somehow the solution is not independence from the authority of society, in the form of individualism and self-determination, but instead subordination to the collective with the sole purpose to wrest from the hands of the oppressors the means of oppression, power, and use it as they claim for good. But if they, in an effort to ignore that institutions themselves cannot be oppressive, set aside classical liberalism since it is grounded in natural law, and instead adopt Marxism, how can we claim that they will use their power for good? If power is the difference between the oppressed and the oppressor, then their aim is the oppression of the outgroup, as many of them have openly acknowledged throughout time, and in that they accept that man is incapable of acting beyond selfishness. If there is only oppressed and oppressor, then for racial inequality, there is only supremacist and second-class citizen. For gender equality, there is only the dominant and subservient gender. For wealth inequality, there is only the working class and the ruling class. So, tell me again, who really believes in social hierarchies? Because I know for each and every example there, the left has a convoluted explanation of how, for example, raising the working class to the position of the ruling class will change the character of political power and eliminate class distinctions, taking with it all class antagonisms. I know, unfortunately, I've read Karl Marx. But again, the issue is just that this requires us to suspend our disbelief in accepting that, even though we know that these problems came from people, somehow people will just forget to be greedy. They will forget to label people based on color, based on creed, or based on gender, and it will just never happen like it did before. Because ultimately, these ideologies make the false assertion that man can be trusted to overcome evil, when evil is something that is learned. But if that's the case, this insinuates that we should consider man to be intrinsically good, despite the fact that this would have him be capable of enacting solutions to these inequities, and generation after generation choosing not to. I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound good to me. That just sounds like the far left is completely unwilling to acknowledge the clear and blatant contradiction at the core of their belief system. I mean, don't get me wrong, I think some left-wing policies and beliefs are completely reasonable. And even for the beliefs that I don't think are, this isn't like a dunk on the left as a whole. But it isn't hard to see the far left's attempts to normalize their beliefs through rhetoric. They try to re-envision the past, giving the modern right a characteristic that never belonged to it. And attempts to justify this characterization only further expose their detachment from reality. They don't tell the world that we believe in social hierarchy because it's something that they can actually substantiate as being true, and especially as being true outside of their own worldview. They villainize us because they see everything through a lens of oppression. They are just tribalists, pretending to be the academic status quo. They see everything as us versus them, and since we don't support their delusions of oppression, they then cast us as the villains in those delusions. They create these elaborate narratives instead of just abandoning those fallacies and joining us and joining moderates in our ongoing conversation about human nature, and about the place of that nature in terms of politics. They want you to believe that I am biased for not wanting to be defined by their worldview. They want you to believe that my rejection of their narratives of oppression means that I support those systems of oppression. They want you to believe that I believe in hierarchy, when the core tenet of my belief necessitates one objective truth, that all men are created equal.